The city was eerily quiet even in the broad daylight. The usual hustle and bustle was replaced by an almost tangible silence that I had never experienced before. My footsteps echoed off the empty streets as I navigated my way to the address on the card. The air was crisp, and the chill seeped into my bones, but it did nothing to quell the storm of thoughts raging in my mind. When I finally arrived at the address imprinted on the business card in my hand, I was taken aback as the sight of the building took my breath away. It was an imposing structure, Gothic and mysterious, standing out starkly against the modern skyline. Shadows seemed to cling to its walls, and an eerie glow emanated from the windows. I hesitated for a moment as the feeling of unknown familiarity washed over me. There were these little voices in my head telling me never to step foot in this imposing establishment, but Aunt Jane's fragile face flashed in my mind, reminding me of why I was here in the first place. Then I realized I couldn't afford to hesitate now, not when her life was hanging by a thread. So, with a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and pushed open the heavy wooden door. It creaked ominously as if the building itself was waking from a long slumber. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something ancient and powerful, but I'm not so sure. The interior was just as imposing as the exterior. Tall, dark bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes that seemed older than time itself. The flickering light from the chandeliers cast long, dancing shadows across the room, making it feel even more like I had stepped into another world. Yet, I was only inside a huge old library in the middle of the busy New York City. The atmosphere was thick with mystery and the weight of countless untold stories. At the far end of the room, behind a large, ornate desk, sat the mysterious man who had given me the card. He was as I remembered, his presence commanding, his eyes sharp and unreadable. My footsteps suddenly faltered as I saw him. And I couldn't help but swallow a lump in my throat the moment I noticed his eyes followed my every move as if he was measuring my resolve. "Mallorie," he said, his voice smooth yet dark, like velvet draped over a blade. "I see you've decided to take the plunge," he added. I was stunned and instantly became immobile as I heard him mention my name as if he had known me forever. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind was racing. How did he know my name? I had never met him before our encounter yesterday. And I hadn't told him, hadn't even uttered a word about myself, and yet, here he was, speaking as if we were old acquaintances. I thought that him knowing about my predicament was odd, but now, it felt nerve-wracking as I realized how much he seemed to know me. The realization sent a chill down my spine, but I quickly shook it off, then tried to keep my composure and immediately quickened my footsteps, letting him know that I was unbothered by him, not one bit. Then, as I neared him, the door on his right, which I hadn't noticed earlier, cracked open, revealing another person whom I assumed was the same age or a year or two older than me. He was wearing a red and black checkered polo, which was left unbuttoned, then underneath it was a plain white shirt, partnered with blue faded jeans and chunky mid-cut leather boots. His slightly long, raven-wavy hair fell below his ears. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. His eyes, a striking shade of green, held mine with an intensity that caught me off guard. I swallowed hard as I felt his already intense gaze getting more intense by the second. There was something in the way he looked at me that made me second-guess my decision to come in here. His blazing orbs were telling me something I couldn't quite decipher. I didn't know how long we'd been staring at each other, but I knew he was the first to look away. Then he moved forward and stopped just before the mysterious old man. "Found what you're looking for, Archie?" The old man mumbled, then gave the person he called Archie an underlook. "No." It seemed like someone had purposely kept that hidden so no one could ever find it. "The guy," Archie retorted. His voice was deep, rich, and commanding, resonating through the room. Its deep timbre adds to the already thick tension. His response seemed to carry more weight than the words alone, hinting at something hidden, something important that eluded his grasp. The old man's expression remained unreadable, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps? Or maybe curiosity. I'm really not sure. Nothing is ever truly hidden here, my boy. You just have to know where to look, he replied, his tone calm but edged with a hint of reprimand. I stood there, feeling like an outsider in a conversation that was both cryptic and significant. My presence seemed almost forgotten as the two men exchanged words. But the way Archie had looked at me earlier, the intensity of his gaze, made it clear that my arrival had not gone unnoticed. There was something in his eyes that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. It made my skin prickle with unease, and it was kinda unnerving. The old man let out an irritated sigh before turning his attention back to me, his sharp eyes locking onto mine with a focus that made my heart skip a beat. Apologies, my dear Mallorie. It seemed like you came in at the wrong time. But worry not, you can always come back. Probably tomorrow if you're free? His shift in demeanor caught me off guard. His tone had softened, but there was an undercurrent of something else, a dismissal or a subtle test of my resolve. The suggestion that I return tomorrow felt like an intentional attempt to push me away, to see if I would waver. But I couldn't afford to wait. Aunt Jane's life was at stake, and every second counted, making me even more desperate. Gathering every ounce of courage, I squared my shoulders and shook my head. No. I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. I'm not leaving, mister. You see, I came here because yesterday you offered me a job. I wanted to accept that. Because I needed the money you'll pay me for my aunt's operation. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, his sharp gaze piercing through me as if trying to gauge my sincerity. The room seemed to grow even colder as the weight of his silence pressed down on me. Archie shifted slightly beside him, his expression unreadable, but I could sense his curiosity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the old man leaned back in his chair, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his lips. Very well, he said slowly, his voice smooth and calculated. If you are so determined, then I will not stand in your way. But understand this, once you accept this job, there is no turning back. The tasks I ask of you may go beyond what you expect, and the consequences may be more than you can handle. His words hung in the air, heavy with ominous implications. But I couldn't let fear deter me now. Aunt Jane needed me, and this was the only way I could see to save her. I understand, I replied, meeting his gaze head-on. I'll do whatever it takes. I continued. The old man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Good, he noted, then he reached into one of the drawers of his desk and pulled out a document. My eyes instinctively darted to the other side, where Archie was standing. I couldn't explain why, but I wanted to see his reactions. As my eyes drifted toward him, I noticed a subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of something unreadable, and a momentary tightening of his jaw. His gaze remained intense, but there was a hint of something else, something he was trying to hide. I couldn't tell if it was concern, doubt, or something more mysterious, but it only deepened the sense of unease that had been growing inside me. Archie's reaction was fleeting, and in an instant, his face was impassive once more, his attention returning to the old man and the document he now held in his hands. This is the contract, the old man said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. He placed the document on the desk and pushed it toward me. It outlines the terms of your employment, including your payment, the tasks you will be required to complete, and the consequences should you fail. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest as I took the document. The paper felt strangely heavy, almost as if it carried more than just words. As I skimmed through the contract, I could see that it was meticulously detailed, with clauses that made my stomach churn. There were conditions that seemed beyond the ordinary, mentioning things like unseen dangers, binding obligations, and irreversible commitments. Despite the unsettling language, I knew I had no other choice. Aunt Jane's face flashed in my mind once again. Her fragile state was a constant reminder of why I was standing here, in this ominous room, with these enigmatic men. Then, as I continued to skim the contract in my hand, my eyes widened at the amount of salary I would be getting once I completed the term of service. It was stipulated that once I signed, I would immediately get the partial payment, which seemed odd, but I wasn't complaining as I needed this money more than I could ever imagine. The sheer amount of the promised salary made my breath hitch. It was far more than I had ever expected, enough to not only cover Aunt Jane's operation, but also provide a level of security I had never known. The offer seemed too good to be true, and a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was a catch or something lurking beneath the surface that I hadn't yet grasped. Still, the promise of immediate partial payment was a lifeline I couldn't afford to ignore. With trembling hands, I continued reading, my eyes tweaking over the clauses that outlined the tasks. Each one was vague, almost cryptic, but they all hinted at something far beyond the mundane. Additionally, there were mentions of retrievals, encounters with unknown entities, and tests of will and endurance. It was a job that required far more than just physical strength or intelligence. It demanded something deeper, something that would push me to my limits. Then my heart pounded as I reached the final page. The last clause was the most ominous of all, saying failure to complete the assigned tasks will result in consequences beyond the physical realm. You are bound by this contract in life and beyond. I swallowed hard, my mouth ran dry as I absorbed the gravity of those words. But as daunting as they were, the thought of Aunt Jane's pleading eyes and frail body kept me grounded. I couldn't walk away now. I couldn't leave her to suffer when I had the chance to save her. Without further hesitation, I reached for the pen the old man offered. As soon as my fingers closed around it, a strange electric sensation ran through my hand, but I ignored it. I was about to sign the contract when I heard someone snort, so I turned to look at the only person I knew who made the sound, and I found him looking at me as if telling me to think about it one more time. I didn't know him, yet he seemed to be sending me signals I couldn't quite comprehend. Dismissing the look he was giving me, I finally made up my mind. So, without wasting another second, I signed my name at the bottom of the contract, my signature flowing across the page with a finality that sent a shiver throughout my entirety. As soon as the ink dried, the old man took the contract back, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," Archie whispered under his gritted teeth. Then, he turned on his back and started walking away. He may be a stranger to me, but Archie's words somewhat scared me, even though they were only whispered and not spoken aloud. His warning lingered in the air, hanging over me like a dark cloud. It felt as if the very walls of the room were closing in, pressing the weight of his unspoken words upon me. But the contract was already signed, and there was no turning back now.